So this is just going to do brief because I know I've just sent an email out this morning. There's an essay that I want you to do, which is on two sources again, because this is the question that throws up the most stress for students, and it's particularly this idea of provenance. And it will have been something that you have come across in GCSE, provenance. Where does the source come from? Can you trust it? That's what it's asking when you think about provenance. The difference is when we kind of take it up a level from GCSE, we've got to move away from our generalized statements, and we'll come on to that in a moment. And our provenance judgments, do we trust it? They've got to be based in evidence. Okay, so we can't get away with, well, I'm going to trust it because the person was there, or I'm going to trust it because it was an eyewitness account. We've got to kind of apply our knowledge to evaluate the provenance of a source. So we come across this skill twice, and it's referred to as the AO2. AO1, that's just straightforward essay writing, no sources at all. Lots of, what we did in the Britain paper. AO2 is this idea of evaluating source material, and it's on the America paper, and we're going to come across it again on warfare as well. Slight difference when we come on to warfare is that you only have one source. So actually, the hardest provenance question is on the America paper, because you've got to evaluate provenance, but you've got to do it with the pair of the sources at the same time, which I think is what makes it tricky. So when we think about evaluating a source, we've talked about this before, 3 main paragraphs. Well, how useful is the content? Place it firmly in its context. How does the date affect the way that the author would be writing about this? And then this third element, which is what we're going to talk about today, which is the provenance of the source. It's easy to get it mixed up with the Thatcher paper. And the difference is on the Thatcher paper, it's actually AO3 Thatcher. That is testing and interpretation. And interpretations come from historians. So we don't have to worry about, who the historian was and when they were writing and why they were writing. We are only evaluating their argument. For AO2, it will be a contemporary source, i.e. it's written by someone there at the time, and it's not an interpretation. So that's why we have got to talk about provenance, and we don't talk about it in the Thatcher question. Does that make sense? Any questions about that? Just someone unmute and say, yes, I understand that. So I'm confident we can move on.
Yeah, I understand that.
Yeah. Thank you. Good. So every time we do a source question on the America paper, we've got like I want you to think of it as a tick list in your head. Questions to ask of a source. And these are the 3 questions. Who has written it? And then start thinking about these questions. Are they a good person to make a comment on this topic, whatever it is? Or is it possible that they're influenced by their gender, their ethnicity, and their political outlook? So you can imagine political outlook is going to be quite important. Do you know whether this person is a Republican or a Democrat? Ethnicity is also going to be a factor. When you've got a source written by an African American, think about what their experiences of being an American in the 1960s would have been like. Could that be influencing their outlook, their view? I nearly said interpretation then, but I avoided it. Then we think about why they are writing it, and particularly who is their audience? Who are they speaking to? Because who you are speaking to is obviously going to affect the way that you are writing. And I think this one is quite unique for America. Where are they saying it? Because if you are say a gay person in New York talking about your experiences of what it was like to be gay in America in, say, the 1960s, that's going to be really different to someone that's living in, pick a place, Utah, rural Utah. Because, you know, we've talked, and that's how you're applying your knowledge. You can say, well, yeah, it's a gay person writing about their experiences in New York, but we have to remember that the outer periphery of America is far more liberal in its outlook. So it wasn't easy, but it was easier to be gay in places like San Francisco and New York than it would have been for those living in the interior of America. Right, so let's see what we need to avoid. These ones are the absolute no-nos. I've talked before about banning this word biased, because just because a source is biased doesn't mean it's not going to be useful. Because the question will always say, how useful are the sources? And actually, biased sources can be really useful because it gives a certain viewpoint. And that's why I want to ban this word. We can't just dismiss all sources by saying, well, they're biased, so they're not useful. We already know, because these are going to be mostly contemporary sources, they're all going to be there at the time. So if we fall into this trap of saying, well, it's really useful because the author was there at the time, we're going to be writing that for every single answer. And well, we've talked about this one before, the author may have forgotten. And that's the kind of key word that I tried to pick up on that fourth bullet point. The author may. If you start using could, might, may, you need to stop yourself, because then you are not using your knowledge to evaluate provenance. You are starting to drift into those generalizations that we've talked about you need to avoid. Okay, any questions about that? Is that clear, straightforward, or have you got anything you want to ask?
Seems fine.
Right, Letitia, you are talking on behalf of the group, it looks like, so I will click on. So I thought what we'll do, we'll just have a look at one. I think, do you know what, I'm just going to read this out. So this is, we're not really worrying about content here, but we'll just zip through it. Some parents are puzzled or confused by Presley's almost hypnotic powers. Others are concerned, perhaps more are a shade disgusted and content to permit the Presley fad to play itself out. Neither criticism of Presley or the teenagers who admire him is particularly to the point. Presley has fallen into a fortune with a routine that in one form or another has always existed on the fringe of show business. In his gyrating figure and aggressive gestures, the teenagers have found something that for the moment seems exciting and important. Quite possibly, Presley just happened to move in where society has failed the teenager. Greater in their numbers than ever before, they may have found in Presley a rallying point. Family counsellors have wisely noted that ours is still a culture in a stage of frantic transition. With even 16-year-olds capable of commanding $20 to $30 a week in their spare time, with access to automobiles at an early age, with communications media of all kinds exposing them to new thoughts very early in life, theirs indeed is a high degree of independence. Inevitably, it has been accompanied by a lessening of parental control. So I'm not going to complicate it by putting in two sources. We're only going to have a look at one. But if we were trying to find out about the appeal of Elvis to teenagers, we're going to ignore the content. We're just going to look at this information at the top. So if we think about provenance, let's look particularly, well, what is going to be relevant here? You tell me what you think is relevant about provenance in that bit at the top of the source.
It's an extract from the New York Times.
Good. I'm glad you picked up on that. I think that was Lily. Yep.
Yeah.
Yep. Why? What is the impact of that? Does that increase its usefulness or diminish it, do you think?
I think it would. Wouldn't it be aimed at, I would say, older people?
Yeah. Keep going.
Would it diminish it?
Yeah, because if you wanted to find out about why Elvis appealed to teenagers, um, where would you go? Where should you go to find out about why he appealed to teenagers?
The teenagers.
Right, yeah, you'd go and ask the teenagers themselves, wouldn't you? And you need to think about who is the audience for the New York Times. And the audience is not teenagers themselves. It's written by and for um, the parental audience, isn't it? It's the parents. That's why they are writing about it. So this is we've talked about where it's come from, New York Times, and we talked about the audience. So we kind of use both of those aspects to say, well, this is not a particularly useful source because it's not the voice of the teenager. This is the voice of parents, and parents, that's not who Elvis appealed to in the late 1950s. So it's not a particularly useful source if we just think about provenance. Do we think it's relevant? This is a New York Times paper. Do we think that, thinking about geography, how might that be relevant?
Well, New York's on the fringe of America, so it's a bit more liberal, so it might it's more likely to be less of an attack on Elvis than it would be if it was in the South.
Yeah, I think it's not, I think that's fair enough, and that particularly comes through in the content. It's not particularly negative towards Elvis. The only thing I would say, and this is again a good example of how you might want to, or how you would kind of incorporate your knowledge and why you need to look at lots of these sources, is that New York Times is not necessarily just for New Yorkers. It is a national publication. So we'd want to try and ideally find out, is the New York Times a liberal? Is it a conservative? Is it tabloid? Is it going to be a broadsheet newspaper? But it is a national one. So you just have to be cautious about saying, well, this is only talking about New Yorkers who tend to be liberal, because actually this is a national publication. So that's all I think probably that's all we would need to talk about when it comes to provenance. I mean, we'll just briefly mention this is 1956. So how's the context? Is this valuable in terms of context and understanding the appeal of Elvis? What's kind of going on late 1950s that we could refer to here? For example, it does say in the source, about third line down, content to permit the Presley fad to play itself out. He's suggesting that this is a temporary phenomenon. Is that true? Anyone? Is Elvis Presley a temporary phenomenon? No, right. I heard someone say very quietly, no. So you could say that that's somewhat diminishing the usefulness of this source, because actually Elvis Presley hasn't reached the height of his powers and his appeal to teenagers. And then you could, make reference to his appearance on the Ed Sullivan Show. So you're kind of starting to draw in some of your knowledge. And perhaps they haven't truly appreciated the impact of rock and roll and the growth of the baby boom, because you could say it's kind of in its infancy, isn't it, in 1956? Okay, right. So 20 minutes, we've done provenance. Has anyone got any more questions about provenance?